February 12, 1945, the Italian Alps. Night had swallowed the mountains. Snow fell like ash through the blackness, soft but endless, erasing every track and every sound. The wind hissed between the white peaks, whispering through frozen fir trees and the half-buried shapes of tents. Beneath that silence lay a battalion, cut off, starving, and lost. Somewhere in the dark, a radio set crackled weakly. Static. Then silence again. The antenna had snapped in the storm, its copper wire now buried under a foot of ice. No signal, no contact. The men of the 10th Mountain Division, alone among the Alpine ridges, stared into a night that offered no rescue. Only snow, hunger, and the thought that command had forgotten them. A corporal leaned over the dead radio. His gloves were torn, his breath shallow in the cold. Around him, men coughed in their sleep, the sound barely louder than the wind. He brushed ice off the transmitter and whispered to no one, "We're not finished yet." He began to search the camp for scrap metal, anything that could catch the faint hum of a world beyond the storm. The wire that would save them had not yet been born. By early 1945, Europe was entering its final convulsions. The Western Allies had broken through France and were pushing toward Germany, while to the south, the long-ignored Italian front dragged on through frozen valleys and shattered peaks. What had once been a sun-drenched campaign of olive groves had turned into a white wilderness. The Apennines and the Alps formed a wall of rock and snow between the advancing Allies and the German Army Group C, which clung to the ridgelines like a wounded animal refusing to die. Among the Americans fighting, there was the 10th Mountain Division, newly arrived and untested. Trained in Colorado's high ranges, its soldiers were climbers, skiers, and mule handlers, men chosen for endurance more than glamour. In February 1945, they were ordered to advance through the Riva Ridge sector, a labyrinth of icy ravines and steep passes guarding the Po Valley beyond. Intelligence promised scattered resistance. Instead, they met the full strength of entrenched German mountain troops and weather that seemed almost sentient in its hostility. Snowfall buried the trails. Supply lines twisted into avalanches. Artillery shells vanished into the fog before they struck. The air was thin, the cold unrelenting, and every breath drew a sting of metal through the lungs. Radios, the lifeline of modern warfare, grew temperamental. Batteries froze solid. Signal wires snapped beneath the weight of snow. What worked in the plains of France became useless above 6,000 feet. Yet communication was the only thread connecting these scattered companies to the wider war. Commanders at the base of the valley sent patrols ahead with cautious optimism. By the second week of February, one battalion pushed too far. Their maps were weeks old, their compass bearings warped by magnetized rock. When the storm closed in, the mountains folded around them like a tomb. They were now 15 miles beyond reliable contact, with the enemy occupying the high ridges and their only radio gone silent. The narrow mountain corridors that once promised stealth now trapped them in a maze of cliffs and drifts. At headquarters, silence spread like contagion. Runners never returned. Air reconnaissance revealed nothing but white sheets of snow. For a full day, nothing. No flare, no Morse code flash, not even a rumor of gunfire. To the men stranded above, that silence became a kind of enemy. Rations dwindled to crumbs of K-bars and half-frozen coffee. Even the mules, half-starved, stood motionless beside their loads, as if waiting for an order that would never come. The American command had prepared for every form of German counterattack, but not for nature's indifference. In those mountains, weather was a greater strategist than any general. Ice crusted the barrels of rifles. Frostbite gnawed at fingers used to trigger radios rather than triggers. Engineers had designed the SCR-300 field set to function in nearly every climate. but its range shrank with every frozen coil. When the antenna snapped, the last pulse of communication vanished into the blizzard. Below them, German Gebirgsjäger patrols prowled the valleys. For them, the Alps were home turf. Every slope familiar, every cave a potential shelter. They moved with practiced silence, confident that the Americans would freeze before they could fight. They believed the mountain itself would finish what artillery began. Up above, the trapped battalion lit small stoves only at night, muffling their flames beneath mess tins to avoid detection. The glow of a single ember became both comfort and hazard. Men spoke little. The sound of wind was constant, a low drone that blended with the faint hum of broken electronics. When the snow ceased for a brief hour, they saw only endless white and the jagged silhouette of Monte Belvedere looming beyond reach. The next objective, now mocking them from miles away. The idea of communication had become almost spiritual. Every soldier kept glancing toward the lifeless radio set, as if expecting it to resurrect itself. It symbolized hope, an invisible bridge to the world beyond the storm, to home, to command, to life. And when it failed, so too did the illusion that technology alone could conquer nature. What none of them knew was that among them sat one man who refused to accept that silence. A radio operator from Iowa, a farmhand turned signalman, began to imagine ways to stretch a signal where none should travel. It was a small thought in a world of vast suffering, but in war, survival often begins with such thoughts. The snow fell again that night, heavy and slow. The mountains closed tighter. Somewhere within that silence, a pair of hands began to tinker. The sound of silence during war is rarely peaceful. In the Alps of 1945, it was lethal. For soldiers trained to depend on coordination, a broken radio was as deadly as an enemy ambush. Every order, every airdrop, every plea for evacuation relied on a handful of frequencies bouncing through frozen air. And those frequencies, in the high mountains, were dying faster than men. The battalion's primary means of communication was the SCR-300, the American walkie-talkie that revolutionized tactical coordination during World War. SATU, developed by Motorola in 1943, it was a 35-pound backpack set, built to withstand heat, dust, and even rain. Yet it had one unforgiving weakness: altitude. Its range, which stretched nearly 10 miles across open plains, could shrink to less than 2 in mountainous terrain. Radio signals traveled in straight lines. In the Alps, those lines met stone. Granite peaks scattered waves like glass shattering in wind, and the cold thickened the air, further strangling transmission. At base, Signal Corps engineers logged the same complaint over and over. No contact. Line of sight blocked. Units experimented with extended whip antennas, strung between trees or mounted to mules, but each modification risked detection by the enemy. German scouts, armed with their own FUG-5 sets, could triangulate signals and call in mortar fire. To send a message was to gamble with one's position. Yet to remain silent was worse. In the Alps, even routine maintenance became impossible. The vacuum tubes inside the SCR-300 were delicate. Their glass casings cracked easily in freezing temperatures. Condensation inside the transmitter would freeze solid, fusing dials and shorting circuits. Operators learned to sleep with the radios beside them, wrapped in blankets like wounded comrades, their breath keeping the tubes just warm enough to function at dawn. But that February, the cold went beyond training. It entered bone and wire alike. The Germans had learned these lessons years earlier. Their Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, carried lighter torn.eb radios, simpler but more reliable. They moved messages via runners and visual signals, relying on human endurance over fragile equipment. The Americans, meanwhile, trusted their machines. It was a faith built on industrial might, a belief that technology could conquer geography. In the mountains, that faith was tested. The stranded battalion's situation worsened each hour. Attempts to reach division headquarters with flares failed. The dense fog devoured light before it could rise. Even the sound of their own mortars bounced unpredictably, echoing off unseen cliffs. To fire was to invite counterfire from invisible guns. The radio, once the heart of the unit, now sat like a corpse. Its silence a daily reminder that progress and innovation meant nothing when stripped of power and wire. Within the Signal Corps, men were trained to think creatively under pressure. Improvisation was not heroism, it was survival doctrine. Manuals advised operators, if the antenna fails, use what is available. Any conductor may carry signal. But few imagined applying that rule in sub-zero snow at 7,000 feet, surrounded by ice and hunger. Still, that phrase lingered in the mind of one soldier, a corporal whose hands knew more of plow steel and tractor wire than of battlefield theory. He began to recall something about resonance, about how a radio's range depended on the length and conductivity of its antenna. The standard whip, 6 feet of metal, was gone, snapped and lost beneath snow. But what if he could replace it? The concept was simple, yet no one in that camp had strength left for theory. The corporals scavenged for parts. Ration tins, mule harness wire, even the thin metal rods from tent frames. Each might serve as conductor. Each offered a chance. It was absurd. A single man, frostbitten, trying to summon a signal through mountains that had swallowed entire divisions. Yet in that absurdity lay the essence of war's innovation, the refusal to surrender to the limits of material. The SCR-300's tuning knob was stiff, its frequency crystal-locked at 40.3 megacycles, the command channel. He twisted it gently, clearing ice from the contacts, and began to splice wire into shape. Around him, men watched silently, not daring to hope. The hiss of static was faint, but it was something. The mountains seemed to listen. Up above, the storm broke for a moment. A brief corridor of clear sky opened between the peaks, the kind of fleeting mercy no manual could predict. The corporal's makeshift antenna caught a fragment of open air, and the radio's speaker exhaled the soft crackle of life. Somewhere in the valley, miles away, a Signal Corps operator froze mid-sentence as a whisper of code flickered across his receiver. Faint, distorted, but human. It was enough. The wire between silence and salvation had just been drawn. He was not a hero, at least not in the way medals imagine one. The corporal's name rarely appeared in reports. Even his photograph, if it exists, is lost to dust. Yet in every war, there is a moment when survival rests on the imagination of one mind refusing to yield. For this man, it began with the cold bite of copper and the stubborn pulse of memory. He had grown up on a farm in the Midwest, where winters were cruel but predictable, and silence was a fact of life. He knew the hum of electric fences, the weight of wire, and the strange satisfaction of making something work with what one had. To him, improvisation was not defiance, it was duty. When the antenna snapped, he did not curse or pray. He simply began to think. War strips men to essentials. In the Alps, every soldier became both engineer and philosopher. They spoke less, dreamed less, but the will to repair, to fix, became its own form of faith. While others clung to weapons, this man clung to circuits and coils, believing that one voice transmitted through the storm might mean more than 100 bullets fired into fog. His frostbitten hands, shaking with exhaustion, became the instruments of a quiet revolution. Survival through creation. Communication was the bloodstream of the modern battlefield. Without it, armies reverted to blind instinct. The stranded battalion represented more than a local mishap. It was the collapse of synchronization, the kind of failure that could unravel an entire front. In the valleys below, division headquarters still planned attacks based on outdated coordinates. Artillery batteries stood ready but directionless, their maps useless without radio correction. Air crews circled above clouds, searching for smoke signals that never rose. Every hour of silence distorted the war's rhythm. A single broken line of communication meant lost men, wasted shells, and dead pilots. The tactical doctrine of 1945 relied on mobility, on radio-driven precision. Yet in the Alps, every modern advantage disintegrated. Orders could not climb mountains. Supply trucks froze in the passes. The enemy, entrenched above, watched with patience born of terrain. They understood what the Americans did not, that isolation was a weapon. Thus, the corporal's small act of improvisation was not merely personal. It restored the anatomy of command. When his signal reached the valley, even faintly, it reconnected the severed nerves of an army. Coordinates could be corrected. Artillery could pivot. Aerial resupply could resume. In war's immense machinery, his wire became a spinal cord. To understand the miracle of that signal, one must first understand the mountains. The Alps in winter are not a landscape. They are an organism, ancient, indifferent, alive in their hostility. Snow does not simply fall, it devours. Wind does not howl, it speaks, shifting every contour until direction itself dissolves. The men of the 10th Mountain Division had trained for altitude, but training could not replicate despair. The slopes were steep enough to break mules' legs. Avalanches could erase entire squads in seconds. Water froze in canteens. Rifles misfired from condensation. Every breath carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut the lungs. Even the silence felt heavy, a physical weight pressing on ears and nerves alike. Geography, in that moment, became ideology. The mountain fought not with bullets, but with endurance. It favored those who adapted, and punished those who relied on control. The Germans had mastered the art of surrendering to the terrain, becoming part of it. The Americans, products of mechanized faith, sought to bend it. Between those two philosophies, a single antenna would form a bridge. The mountain also shaped perception. Visibility shrank to mere feet, sound distorted, distances lied. Men hallucinated shapes in the snow, mistaking stones for enemies, echoes for voices. Isolation eroded reality. The radio, therefore, was not merely a device. It was a tether to sanity. Each burst of static proved that the world still existed beyond the ridge. When the corporal's improvised antenna finally trembled with life, it was not only physics that changed, it was perception. The men looked up from their frozen trenches and for the first time in days believed that someone might hear them. The mountain had not won yet. The human, tactical, and environmental layers converged on that single act. A man repairing a link between will and survival. Yet the story deepens further into the realms of technology, psychology, and moral symbolism. How one broken piece of wire became a metaphor for an entire nation's resilience. The American war machine of the 1940s was built on precision, on the promise that circuits, wires, and blueprints could defeat chaos. Yet every invention had its breaking point. The SCR-300, for all its brilliance, was never designed for the deep valleys of the Alps. Its 6-foot whip antenna relied on clean propagation, a straight, open path between sender and receiver. But war does not provide straight paths. The corporal's improvised solution was an act of instinct more than theory. He stripped insulation from tent poles, scavenged copper wiring from mule harnesses, and stretched the pieces together into a rough spiral. An unorthodox shape, but one capable of catching reflected waves bouncing from nearby rock faces. What he unknowingly created was a crude directional antenna, a design that would later influence field repair manuals across the signal corps. When he keyed the transmitter and heard that faint hum of static, he redefined what American technology meant. It was not the factory-perfect machine that saved his battalion, but the willingness to reshape it. Innovation had shifted from laboratories to the frozen hands of a soldier in the dark. Years later, after the war, engineers studying Signal Corps field reports cited dozens of similar improvisations, antennas made from barbed wire, rifle barrels, even bayonets. Each instance proved that war's greatest laboratory was the battlefield itself. In that way, the Corporal's Act became both invention and philosophy. That resilience was the truest form of technology. For the men trapped among the peaks, silence became the loudest sound. It crept into thoughts, stretched seconds into hours, and replaced logic with dread. In the absence of command, every soldier fought not only the enemy, but his own imagination. The snow seemed endless, the cold eternal. The radio's failure had done more than sever communication. It had stripped them of identity. In modern warfare, belonging was tied to the voice of command, to orders that affirmed existence. Without that, they were ghosts in the mountains. Men began to speak less, their sentences fragmenting like broken transmissions. Even discipline faltered, replaced by ritual, checking rifles, melting snow for water, watching the sky for planes that never came. When the corporal began tinkering with the wrecked set, he did not merely repair a machine. He restored a sense of purpose. The others watched him, silently at first, then with growing hope. In war, hope is contagious. Each spark of static became a heartbeat, a reminder that they were still part of something. Larger psychologists studying post-war testimonies from the 10th Mountain Division often noted that communication was the single greatest determinant of morale. Units that maintained radio contact, even sporadically, exhibited far lower rates of psychological collapse. The corporal's antenna, therefore, did more than call for help. It steadied minds. It proved that even in isolation, one voice could anchor many. War is the collapse of order, but it also exposes what order truly means. The Germans in the mountains relied on rigid hierarchy, commands descending like avalanches, precise and cold. The Americans, in contrast, thrived on improvisation. Their strength lay not in uniformity, but in the individual's capacity to act when the system failed. The corporal's antenna became a symbol of that philosophy, a democracy of invention. No permission, no manual, just necessity and will. In his hands, scrap metal became lifeline. Failure became opportunity. It was a moral statement in physical form. Freedom breeds resourcefulness. To the German observers who later found remnants of the battalion's camp, the contraption must have seemed crude, even foolish. But in its crude geometry lay an idea that would define the post-war century. That abundance was not merely material wealth, but the liberty to create without constraint. That single antenna represented a civilization's contrast. The Axis powers, steeped in control and obedience, viewed improvisation as weakness. The Allies, particularly the Americans, viewed it as strength, the spark of individual genius that could turn disaster into triumph. When historians later wrote about the 10th Mountain Division's campaign, they described the mountains as the last proving ground of democracy. It was there, amid frost and failure, that ideals were tested not through speeches or politics, but through acts of survival. The corporal's invention was not strategic genius. It was the human spirit refusing to obey the limits imposed by environment or authority. The wire that stretched across that frozen camp became something more than equipment. It was the physical embodiment of connection, the thin thread between isolation and community, chaos and communication, death and deliverance. In the wind, it sang faintly, a metallic hum that merged with the mountain's voice. That hum carried symbolism deeper than any radio signal. It echoed the American belief that freedom itself is a form of signal, fragile, often distorted, but always striving to reach someone beyond the storm. Each vibration in that improvised antenna was a message. We are still here. In time, the battalion would hear planes circling above once more. The faint tremor of the antenna's metal would mark the turning of their fortune. But before rescue came, before supplies fell, that wire had already done something greater. It had resurrected belief. As the storm cleared and the signal reached headquarters, a transformation began, not only for one battalion, but for the Army's understanding of innovation and survival itself. A faint, improvised connection had turned into a beacon of human ingenuity. February 13th, 1945, 04:20 hours. The night had hardened into glass. Every breath fractured into frost as the men of the 10th Mountain Division crouched among the snow-laden rocks, waiting for dawn that refused to come. Silence ruled the ridge. Even the wind had died, as if the mountain itself was listening. The corporal sat hunched over the field set, his gloved fingers numb and cracked. Before him lay the improvised antenna, a desperate sculpture of wire, tent poles, and ration tins. It looked absurd, even pitiful. Yet it was all that remained between the battalion and oblivion. He had built it through the night, guided only by instinct and faint recollections of training. He twisted each length of scavenged metal into a rough helical coil, calculating nothing, only hoping that some harmonic, some accidental resonance might bridge the peaks. Each wire hissed as it stiffened in the cold, snapping if bent too sharply. He wrapped the joints with strips of cloth, the last remnants of his gloves, and elevated the structure on a rifle butt jammed into the snow. Behind him, a dozen eyes watched, hollow from hunger and frostbite. They no longer expected rescue. They simply wanted to see if something still worked in a world that had stopped. The corporal adjusted the tuning dial. Nothing. Then, faintly, the hiss of static. It was like hearing life again. He turned the gain up slowly. Static gave way to distortion, then to something else. A whisper, almost human, lost beneath layers of interference. He leaned closer. The air felt electric. He tapped the transmitter once, twice, then pressed the key. "This is Able Company, 10th Mountain Division. Request coordinates confirm. Over." His voice cracked as he spoke. No reply. He tried again, and again. Minutes passed. The mountains remained mute. The men behind him began to turn away, disappointed but unsurprised. Hope in war dies quietly. The corporal lowered his head, exhausted. Then, from the speaker, a faint sound. 2 bursts of static, evenly spaced. Then a third, a signal. The corporal froze. He tapped his key in response. Receiving, repeat. Receiving, faint. The radio crackled, sputtered, then delivered what no one expected to hear. A voice, thin and metallic, struggling through the ether. Copy, able, confirm signal, repeat coordinates, supply drop scheduled, over. The effect was instantaneous. Every man turned, disbelief melting into motion. The corporal repeated the coordinates, his words trembling. The connection faded, then strengthened again. Unstable, but alive. The men could barely breathe. For a moment, they forgot the cold, the hunger, the fear. For a moment, they were heard. Below, in the command post miles away, Signal Corps operators stared at their receivers in astonishment. They had long written off Able Company as missing, presumed lost to the storm or to German guns. Yet now, against all odds, a weak but steady transmission pierced the static. The coordinates were faint but legible. Engineers recalculated positions, charting the impossible. A working set transmitting from deep within the high passes. Orders rippled through the headquarters. Aircraft crews scrambled to load supplies. Artillery units recalibrated their firing solutions. Commanders redrew lines on the map. In 1 hour, a broken antenna and a determined corporal had reconnected an entire front. Up on the ridge, the battalion's sergeant clasped the corporal's shoulder. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Around them, men began to prepare fires. Small ones at first, hidden from view. For the first time in days, smoke rose deliberately rather than by accident. The radio's hum became the camp's heartbeat, but the danger was not over. The signal, faint and sporadic, risked exposure. German patrols could intercept and triangulate it. The corporal adjusted power output to minimize detection, sending bursts at intervals. Every message was a gamble, yet the decision was clear. Better to risk discovery than to vanish in silence. The morning light finally breached the peaks. A dull gray dawn spilled across the snow, illuminating the makeshift antenna. Its crude shape glistened like a spider's web frozen in ice. Against all logic, it had worked. Later that morning, the faint drone of aircraft began to echo through the valleys. The men lifted their heads, squinting upward. The sound grew louder, distinct. American C-47s approaching from the south. A cheer rippled through the ranks, faint but real. Some wept silently, others laughed without sound. The corporal, still crouched by the set, kept sending short bursts of confirmation. Signal clear. Location marked. Thank you. Over. In the distance, parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the sky. Supplies, ammunition, medical kits, food, each one a lifeline. The men stood transfixed as the first crates thudded into the snow. For many, the sight of those chutes felt divine. For the corporal, it was simply physics fulfilled. He dismantled part of the antenna afterward, preserving the shape in memory. The rest he left standing, swaying faintly in the wind, a symbol of connection, resilience, and stubborn belief. That day, the Alps, ancient, indifferent, brutal, heard a new kind of sound. Not gunfire, but communication. The faint hum of signal in the storm had turned defeat into deliverance. The moment of transmission had changed everything. Yet the story was not finished. Ahead lay the German counteroffensive, the fragile relay of reinforcements, and the struggle to keep that thread of connection alive amid renewed fire and frost. The antenna had worked once. Now, it had to endure. By mid-morning, the sky had turned from slate to pale silver, a deceptive calm masking the danger below. The snowfields glistened with the scattered cargo from the airdrop. Parachutes tangled in trees, crates half buried in drifts, precious food and ammunition lying like relics of civilization amid ruin. The men moved with the slowness of exhaustion, their bodies stiff, their minds still disbelieving that help had found them. The corporal remained by the radio, unwilling to disconnect even for a moment. The signal that had pierced the mountains was fragile. One wrong adjustment, one loose wire, and silence would return. He tuned and retuned, keeping the frequency alive in short bursts. Each message sent a pulse through the white emptiness. Alive, holding position, awaiting orders, but help had drawn attention. In the valley below, German observers caught sight of the circling aircraft and knew at once that something had changed. Intercept teams unpacked their compact Fuji-10 sets, listening for the alien rhythm of Allied transmission. By noon, the enemy began to probe the ridges with mortar fire. Blind, uncertain, but deadly enough. The first shells struck short, shaking the snow loose from the slopes. The mountain answered with its own artillery. An avalanche. A wall of snow tore down a neighboring ravine, devouring trees and silence alike. The shockwave rolled through the camp, burying half the antenna's mast. The corporal and two others dug frantically, uncovering the wire before it snapped. His gloves shredded against the ice, blood freezing to metal. But the connection held. He keyed the transmitter again, voice steady. Under fire, holding signal. Coordinates unchanged. Request artillery cover. Miles away, at the command post, the reply came instantly. A crisp voice through layers of static. Roger, Able Company. Fire mission inbound. Within minutes, Allied guns opened up from the valley floor, their shells arcing over the peaks. To the trapped battalion, The distant thunder sounded like deliverance. Snow geysers erupted along the opposite slope, silencing the German batteries that had crept too close. The antenna trembled with every concussion, but still it sang. The corporal crouched beside it as if guarding a heartbeat. Around him, men moved with renewed purpose, securing perimeters, retrieving supplies, tending to the wounded. The radio's low hum threaded through the camp like music. It was the sound of belonging. That night, the temperature plunged again. The men huddled near smoldering fires, fed by fragments of broken sleds. In the faint orange glow, the antenna's twisted wires gleamed like veins of light. Each burst of transmission illuminated faces hollowed by fatigue, yet softened by hope. The corporal kept the set alive through the dark hours, sending regular status reports, adjusting for interference as the storm returned. When dawn rose, the peaks were veiled in cloud, but the sky carried a promise. Engine noise, steady and close. The first rescue column, a convoy of tracked weasels and mules, was crawling up the valley, guided by the very coordinates that Antenna had delivered. It would take them a day to reach the ridge, but they were coming. The Germans, realizing their trap was broken, launched a last counterattack. Machine gun fire cracked from a hidden slope. The Americans answered with mortars guided directly by radio. The corporal relayed fire corrections with calm precision, adjusting each bracket until the enemy guns fell silent. What had once been a static-ridden experiment was now a weapon of coordination. By afternoon, the snowstorm thinned, revealing movement on the lower trail. Figures in white camouflage climbing toward them. Friendly flares marked positions, and soon the sharp bark of engines joined the wind. Reinforcements had arrived. The lost battalion was lost no more. When the first rescuers reached the camp, they found men gaunt but grinning, too weary even to stand. Beside the radio, half buried in frost, the corporal sat motionless, hands still on the key. The antenna rose behind him like a monument of wire and will. One officer would later write in his report, "Signal maintained under impossible conditions. Saved 126 men." They dismantled the contraption carefully, coiling its frozen wire into the corporal's pack. Command wanted it studied. The Alpine antenna, they called it. The name stuck. Months later, replicas appeared in training manuals under field expedients. Mountain operations. As night fell once more, the ridge lay quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of the set, sending one final message. Rescued. All accounted for. Antenna operational. Thank you. Then the switch was thrown, and for the first time in days, the radio was silent by choice. Below, the column wound its way down toward the valley, leaving the mountains to their eternal cold. Behind them, the wind tugged at the abandoned pole until the wire snapped and vanished into the snow, its purpose fulfilled. The Alps closed again, indifferent but changed, holding within their vast silence the echo of a signal that had refused to die. The battle for survival had ended, but the consequences of that signal were only beginning. New doctrine, new respect for ingenuity, and a quiet recognition that one man's improvisation could alter the fate of hundreds. In the days that followed the rescue, the ridge above the valley became a graveyard of snow and memory. The wind covered footprints, the fires went cold, and the sound of aircraft faded into the same silence that had nearly claimed them. But for the men who descended from the heights, the memory of that sound, the faint hum of the radio, would never leave. When the convoy reached Allied lines, medics counted frostbite cases, broken limbs, and the thin, pale faces of men who had gone days without warmth or sleep. Yet not one was missing. Against all odds, every life had been accounted for. A battalion returned from absence, one officer wrote in his report, brought back not by arms, but by wire. At division headquarters, Engineers gathered around the battered SCR-300 set that had carried the signal. They examined the crude antenna with disbelief. Bent tent poles, ration tin reflectors, copper stripped from pack straps. A design born of desperation, yet capable of reaching 30 miles across broken terrain. The corporal stood silently as technicians took notes and photographs. He refused to call it invention. He called it luck mixed with stubbornness. But luck alone does not hold a signal through wind and rock. Commanders saw in that tangle of wire a doctrine rewritten. That initiative was the highest form of discipline. Within a week, the Signal Corps issued a memorandum across the Fifth Army front. Field expedient antennas approved where necessary. Innovation encouraged under extreme conditions. The line might have been bureaucratic, but it marked a quiet revolution. From then on, mountain units carried extra spools of wire and scrap metal. Soldiers were taught to build with whatever the terrain allowed. Manuals illustrated the alpine pattern, sketched from the corporal's design. It became legend in training halls from Colorado to Camp Crowder, a lesson that the most reliable connection was the one made by human imagination. For the battalion, survival carried a strange weight. They returned to duty within weeks, their ordeal reduced to a few paragraphs in official communiques. Yet among themselves, the story spread in whispers. How one man refused to surrender to silence. How a strand of copper had brought voices back from the void. War's bureaucracy recorded it differently. The after-action report listed it under signal restoration, field innovation, and attached no name. Perhaps that anonymity suited the event. The Corporal's Act was never about recognition. It was about restoring the thread between life and command, between the individual and the whole. When spring came and the snow began to melt, patrols passing through the area found fragments of the original antenna, bits of wire protruding from thawing drifts, pieces of tin rusted but intact. One soldier, years later, described seeing them like relics of a faith no longer needed but never forgotten. The Alps, unchanged and unmoved, had absorbed the story. The mountains do not remember names, but they remember echoes. And somewhere in those ridges, the faintest vibration of that first transmission might still linger, bouncing endlessly between peaks. The immediate crisis was over, but the story of that signal would ripple far beyond the Alps, into training doctrines, post-war technology, and the moral philosophy of a generation that learned how creativity could be as decisive as courage. When the 10th Mountain Division pushed northward again in March 1945, few outside its ranks knew the story of the ridge and the radio. But in technical circles, word spread quickly. The Signal Corps' internal bulletin, Communications in the Field, published a brief report. Improvised aerial established contact under adverse atmospheric and terrain conditions. Battalion saved. The article was unsigned, yet copies circulated among engineers like sacred text. At Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, the heart of American signal research, instructors began using the Alpine incident as a case study. They displayed the photographs of the contraption beside pristine factory models, emphasizing the same lesson repeated since the trenches of 1918. Equipment may fail, but ingenuity must not. Young recruits were told that discipline meant not only obeying orders, but defying limitations. When the manual ends, one colonel declared, your mind begins. The story outgrew its technical origins. By 1946, as returning veterans filled universities under the GI Bill, the tale of the antenna found its way into classrooms and newspapers. Writers invoked it as proof of the American temperament. The belief that individual creativity could triumph over mechanical failure and nature itself. In post-war speeches, generals spoke of the wire in the snow as a metaphor for resilience, the unseen link that bound free men together in the face of adversity. Historians now recognize the incident as a turning point in field communication philosophy. Before the Alps, innovation flowed downward, from laboratory to soldier. Afterward, it began to move both ways. Battlefield improvisations were collected, analyzed, and fed back into design. The ANPRC-10, successor to the SCR-300, incorporated adjustable frequency tuners and lighter, flexible antennas, direct descendants of those wartime improvisations. The field had learned humility. No design was perfect until it had survived chaos. Beyond technology, the event influenced culture. To the soldiers who heard the story secondhand, the nameless corporal became a symbol of quiet heroism, a reminder that survival often depended not on valor under fire, but on the calm patience to fix what was broken. In an age that worshipped machines, he had reasserted the primacy of human thought. In broader ideological terms, the wire he strung across the snow came to represent something larger than communication. It embodied the democratic ideal itself: connection over hierarchy, invention over obedience. The war had pitted centralized command against decentralized freedom, and in that frozen experiment, freedom had prevailed. A man who answered to no order but necessity had achieved what no staff plan predicted. After the war, as Europe rebuilt its shattered systems, American engineers brought with them the same philosophy: adaptability as strategy. In Korea, radio operators recalled the Alpine improvisation when they used scrap aluminum to extend signal range through valleys. In Vietnam, soldiers would repeat the practice, fashioning antennas from C-ration cans and salvaged wire. Each adaptation carried the same DNA, a lineage of defiance born in snow. For decades, veterans of the 10th Mountain Division would meet in quiet reunions. Among them, someone would always mention the wire that talked. They would speak of it not as miracle, but as testament. In a war defined by destruction, it was creation that had saved them. When the corporal died years later, long after the war, there were no parades, no medals pinned. Yet in Signal Corps classrooms, his story endured, told to new generations who learned to see a spool of wire not as scrap, but as possibility. The mountains where it happened remain unchanged, jagged, eternal, indifferent. But somewhere within their granite silence, the echo of that improvised signal still belongs to history. The whisper of a civilization that believed the smallest act of invention could redeem even the vastness of war. That act of ingenuity had done more than save lives. It had reaffirmed a belief that freedom itself is a kind of frequency, fragile but persistent, carried forward by those who refuse to fall silent. The war would end within months, but its lessons would echo long after the guns fell silent. Among them, none were quieter or deeper than the lesson of that frozen signal. In a world defined by destruction, salvation had come not from superior firepower, nor from sweeping strategy, but from the simple act of invention. One man, one broken radio, one thread of copper against a mountain of silence. It was never meant to last, yet it endured long enough to prove that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it hums faintly through static, carried by the will to be heard. In that moment, technology and humanity met in perfect symmetry, not as master and servant, but as partners in survival. The antenna, crude and trembling in the wind, became a symbol of the greater war being fought, a war for connection. Against tyranny's isolation, democracy offered communication. Against obedience, imagination. Against silence, the insistence on speech. The Alps have forgotten their names, their faces, their frozen camp, but the idea they carried endures, that freedom, like a radio signal, must be maintained, tuned, repaired, defended, by those who refuse to accept the dead air of indifference. In every generation since, soldiers, engineers, and dreamers have faced their own mountains, some of snow, others of fear or doubt or isolation, and still, the same truth hums through history's static. When all seems lost, there is always a way to reach beyond the storm. It is not the perfection of machines that defines a civilization, but the imperfection of its men. Their willingness to improvise, to adapt, to rebuild the line when it fails. In that sense, the corporal's antenna was never just wire. It was the shape of belief, the quiet, stubborn belief that no signal, once born in courage, is ever truly lost. Somewhere, high among those cold ridges, the wind still carries that faint metallic hum, the echo of a connection once made, and the promise that even in the darkest silence, the human spirit will find a way to speak.